Let's talk a little bit about Ayurveda for anxiety. The first thing that I want to do is explain how I use Ayurveda when I'm dealing with patients with anxiety, to give us sort of a sense of how it fits in to a broader and more comprehensive approach to anxiety. So let's take a look at sort of what we know from science and psychiatry when it comes to anxiety. So to start out with, we have genetics, right? And it's cool because we've learned so much about the human genome. And we know that there are some genes that actually predispose you to anxiety. That's awesome. I mean, it's not awesome, but it's cool that we know that. And then we also know that from clinical psychiatry, we give people diagnoses. And once you have a diagnosis, it's sort of not really permanent, but it tends to linger around for a long time, right? It's not like you get diagnosed with anxiety one week and then we take the diagnosis away the next week. And once you get diagnosed with anxiety, you'll probably start treatment for anxiety. And so let's think about something like an SSRI, which is a daily medication that you take which reduces your overall level of anxiety. So what we kind of see from science is that we've got all of these like risk factors like genetics, which are sort of set, I mean, they're set in stone, right? They're your genes, they're in every cell of your body and they don't really change over the course of your life. And we sort of have a diagnosis which really doesn't change from day to day. And ideally, we don't have a treatment that changes from day to day. And so everything is sort of fixed, right? These are the genetics, this is the diagnosis, this is the treatment. You take your treatment every day, your diagnosis is the same every day, which should suggest that our anxiety should be the same every day. But the simple truth is that when people experience anxiety, that's not how it is at all, right? Really what happens is despite all of these things up here being the same, people's anxiety fluctuates. They have some days that their anxiety is really bad and some days that their anxiety is really good. And it's kind of weird because then the question becomes why, right? So if my diagnosis is the same, if my genes are the same and my treatment is the same, what accounts for this fluctuation in my anxiety symptoms? And this is where I think really Ayurveda shines, because Ayurveda is the best system of medicine that I've encountered that kind of accounts for this fluctuation and explains why this fluctuation happens. So Ayurveda is really all about managing the risk factors that contribute to anxiety on a day-to-day basis. It's not really a treatment for anxiety, so we're not really fixing it. But there are all of these constellations of things that will make anxiety better on a particular day or worse on a particular day. Things like diet and technology use and routine all affect how anxious people are. And the interesting thing is that if you ask a psychiatrist, despite taking the same medicine every day, why am I really anxious on one week and I feel pretty good the other week? What the psychiatrist will tell you is some generic kind of non-nuanced thing like stress. They'll ask you like, how are you sleeping? And then if you say, I'm not sleeping well, they'll say, well, you need to get better sleep. And then it's like, continue taking your pill and out the door. And this is why we're going to talk about Ayurveda. So remember that in Ayurveda, there are 3 doshas. And when we think about anxiety, we're basically thinking about the Vata dosha. And also remember, we're going to do just kind of a quick review, that Vata is also genetically linked. So everyone has kind of like on a scale of 100 to 0, everyone has a natural level of Vata. So some people may be, so let's say this is 80, this is 60, this is 40, this is 20. So some people may be like right here, whereas other people are over here. So some people will have sort of naturally high Vata and some people will have naturally low Vata. And in addition to that, what Ayurveda posits is that depending on our lifestyle and diet and things like that, our Vata can actually go up or go down. And what happens when we think about anxiety is that I kind of think about anxiety as a Vata score above 75. So when you kind of cross over, and let's say this is 75, and when your Vata gets way too high, then you manifest with symptoms of anxiety. So our goal from an Ayurvedic perspective is not to treat anxiety directly, but to actually bring our Vata down. And the more we bring it down, the better our anxiety is going to feel on a day-to-day basis. So then the question naturally becomes, what can we do to bring our anxiety down? What can we do to bring our Vata down? So we're going to talk about 4 different things. We're going to touch on diet, we're going to touch on digestion, we're going to touch on routine, and we're going to touch on technology. So the first thing we'll talk about is diet. So remember that in Ayurveda, diet tends to be our first line intervention for balancing our doshas. There are particular foods that will increase vata and particular foods that will decrease vata. And our goal here is to use diet to kind of balance our vata, bring it down to sort of a nice medium level. And so generally speaking, when we're dealing with anxiety, we want vata reducing foods, because remember that anxiety is a vata that's way too high. So let's start with the qualities of vata, and then what we're going to try to do is pick foods that balance those qualities. So remember, first and foremost, that vata is like the wind. So the wind is fast, it's cold, it's dry, right? And so the foods that we want, the foods that we want to avoid are going to be those kinds of foods. So we want to avoid things that are cold. We want to avoid things that are light, and we want to avoid things that are dry. The next thing is that vata is also increased by processed foods, especially refined sugars and stimulants. So we want to be careful about things that are heavily processed, as well as things like caffeine or other kinds of stimulant stuff. So like energy drinks and things like that really make vata way worse. So try to steer clear of those. As for what kinds of foods we want to eat the opposite of what vata is. So if vata is light, because if we think about the wind is pretty light, right? We want to eat foods that are heavy. If vata is cool, we want to eat foods that are warm. And if vata is dry, we want to eat foods that are wet. And once again, steer clear of the processed stuff. So a good example of this, so let's like take a couple of options, right? So one example that I'll share is that for my vata patients or people who have anxiety, I'll recommend soup instead of salad. So if we look at salad is cold. It can be a little bit wet, for sure, but it's also very difficult to digest. And what we really want to do is have something like a soup that's kind of like brothy. It's also a little bit heavier. It's a little bit warmer. So it'll sort of ground that vata down. Another good example is like, let's take a look at breakfast, right? So a lot of people will have toast for breakfast. And so if we look at toast, what are the qualities of toast? It tends to be warm and dry and light. So instead, we'd want something like oatmeal, which is a little bit heavier, a little bit thicker, a little bit warmer and moist. So I'd recommend that people shift from something like toast to oatmeal. And in general, vatas do really well with like cooked vegetables as opposed to raw vegetables, because the digestive power of vatas tends to be a little bit lower, and we'll segue to digestion in a second. So we want to think about foods that are warm, foods that are moist, foods that are heavy. So for vatas, I'll recommend things like soups, stews, gravies. The good news is that vatas get to eat a lot of really delicious stuff. The next thing that we're going to touch on is digestion. Now, a lot of people think that diet and digestion, like, isn't that the same thing? But actually, they're discretely different. And so if we think about what diet really is diet is what you choose to put into your body. But digestion is the way that your body processes what goes in. So there are certainly links. So vatas tend to have a weak digestive energy, which means that they can't tolerate very large meals at one time. And it also means that they tend to do better with cooked foods. And if we think about cooked foods tend to be warmer. So things like grilled squash or zucchini or things like that, instead of salad, tend to be really, really good. Roasted vegetables, awesome for vatas. So that's kind of where diet and digestion connect. But now we're going to talk a little bit more on Ayurveda's view of digestion. So the first thing is that anxiety and vata stem from improper management of the colon. So that sounds kind of weird, but Ayurveda basically says that bad vata and bad anxiety start in the colon. And more specifically, they start with constipation. So our goal from an Ayurvedic perspective to balance our digestion and manage vata is going to be all about getting your bowels cleared. So in the Ayurvedic system, they believe that a toxin builds up in our colon called ama. And ama is sort of like, we're not really sure if it physically exists or not, but the general idea is that vatas have difficulty moving stuff through their bowels. And so as food stays stuck in your bowels, you don't absorb nutrients properly. And literally what happens is the food starts to rot. And as the food rots, and we actually have some evidence of this, so we know that, for example, bacteria are populated throughout our GI tract, and if food stays down there too long, bacteria will start to ferment that food and produce gas. And gas is also a very vata characteristic, because remember, vata is the wind. So we're not really sure if this is scientifically valid or not in terms of the theory behind it, but we definitely know that Ayurvedic approaches to reducing vata do appear to clinically impact anxiety. So we're going to sort of trust that the mechanism is in there somewhere. Maybe science hasn't really figured it out yet. And we're going to really think about optimizing our constipation and kind of optimizing or reducing our ama production. So the goal in vata digestion is to get our bowels moving so that the stuff doesn't sit there, doesn't start to rot and ferment and kind of build these toxins up. And remember that those kinds of toxins and that bacterial activity, if you guys have seen the video on brain gut stuff, you'll remember that that causes inflammation and all that kind of good stuff, which will make anxiety worse. So our goal is going to be to evacuate the bowels and keep ourselves having regular bowel movements. So how do we do that? So we're going to share with you a couple of Ayurvedic remedies that can really help you manage your constipation. So the first is that I'll tell my patients to eat a banana on an empty stomach every morning. So there's something about the osmotic gradient of a banana and sort of eating it on an empty stomach in the morning really facilitates good bowel movements. Another example of something that I'll recommend is taking like 1 to 2 tablespoons of fenugreek that has been soaked overnight in water on an empty stomach in the morning. So you can take this either before or after the banana. And so fenugreek seeds are actually like a very good, once again, osmotic agent for constipation. And what osmotic means is that the fenugreek seeds will sort of like pull water from our body sort of into the gut. And once we kind of have that osmotic pressure and we pull that water into the middle of the intestine, it kind of loosens things up and we don't get that constipated dry stool. So these are just 2 examples of things that will be sort of traditionally vata remedies for alleviating constipation and alleviating that ama production. The good news is that if you start to move your bowels on a very regular basis, that ama will start to clear out of your system. And so Ayurvedic remedies for digestion may not work. You may not notice anything in a couple of days or a couple of weeks, because that's usually the time window that pharmaceutical medications work. When we really think about Ayurveda, we're thinking about more long-term solutions that kick in slower. So the second thing is digestion. The third thing that we're going to talk about is routine. Now, this one is a real problem because vatas really hate routine, because their natural tendency is to be free spirits. So their routine can be all over the place. The downside is that they really need routine. So what we're going to talk about are a couple of key tips for vatas and how to kind of think about planning your day. So the first thing is that vatas come online early. So when I think about a good work day for a vata, I don't think about a 9 to 5, I think a little bit more like an 8 to 3. So vatas tend to come online early, but they don't really have the stamina to be very, very functional at the end of the day. So if you're a vata, one of the things that you can really do to kind of optimize it, or if your vata is elevated, one of the things that you can do to really bring it down is to start early and to try to wrap up early on in the day. The next thing we're going to discuss in terms of routine for vata is meals. So vatas have eyes that are bigger than their stomach. And what I mean by that is that they'll feel very, very intensely hungry and will want to eat tons of food, but ultimately don't need a whole lot of food to feel satiated. And what this means is that if vatas actually eat to the extent of their hunger, it's that food load is actually kind of way too high and they'll go into a food coma. So if you're trying to plan a good routine to balance your vata, what you need to do is schedule frequent meals that tend to be relatively small. It's okay to have one really heavy meal at the end of the day, can feel really satisfying for vatas, and then just kind of let yourself pass out. The next thing, speaking of passing out, is sleep. So sleep is crucial to vatas, and at the same time can be really challenging because vatas can really suffer from things like insomnia and anxiety. So a good sleep schedule is crucial, and this is where, especially for if your vata is out of balance or you have a very naturally high vata, the way to get a handle on sleep isn't bedtime, it's actually waking time. So remember that vatas come online early. So oftentimes if I'm trying to get someone who has too high a vata to get a regular sleep schedule, remember that the goal here is to get you to pass out and have a really good night's sleep. And the best way to get you to pass out and have a really good night's sleep is actually to wake up early in the morning. So if I'm trying to help someone balance their vata, what I'll advocate for is it doesn't matter what time you went to bed, wake up at like 6 a.m. And it's going to be a little bit brutal to begin with, but it's pretty cool because your mind will actually be able to adjust to that relatively easily. And then the even cooler thing is that you'll be so exhausted at the end of the day that hopefully passing out will be easy. So there's a very actually complicated and in-depth branch of Ayurveda called Dinacharya. And Dinacharya means daily routine. And so there's a lot of detail about what the right daily routine for Vatas is. And this is just one quick kind of overview of a couple of key points around Vatas and daily routine. The fourth thing that we're going to cover is actually really, really important and really problematic in today's society, which is technology use. So unfortunately, basically any technology use increases Vata. And we're not quite sure why this is, but there's overwhelming evidence that on the whole, our society is becoming more Vata. Like everyone across the globe is becoming more Vata. The rates of ADHD are shooting through the roof. The rates of anxiety are shooting through the roof. And if we look at these two illnesses, what are they? They're elevated Vata. And so what's changing in society? There are all kinds of stuff to be changing, but certainly technology use is at the top of the list. So if we think about it, how does technology use actually increase Vata? So technology is all about notifications and engagement and doing lots of different things with your mind. We can see that a lot of technology use isn't about having your mind sit in one place, but actually induces your mind to jump around and be more like the wind. Oh, I've got a notification from an app over here, and I get a message over here, and oh, look, this video has just been uploaded. I should definitely check that out. And Netflix is suggesting this to me. So if we look at all of our devices, what they're doing is hammering us with stimuli, right? This is where people talk about being able to multitask, which you really can't do. It's a terrible idea. But essentially, technology is driving our mind to have a shorter attention span and to shift our attention from one place to the other. So what are some things that we can do to try to reduce the impact of technology on Vata? We're going to cover a couple. The first that I'm going to talk about is actually UV light. So there's good evidence that shows that UV light interferes with our ability to sleep, and especially the wavelength of light that is emitted by phones and computer screens and televisions. So we have this gland right here in our forehead called the pineal gland or the pineal gland. And the pineal gland secretes something called melatonin. And melatonin gets us ready to sleep. A lot of people will take melatonin, you can kind of buy it over the counter, and it's sort of a sleep aid. But the way that melatonin works is that our brains actually understand when it's daytime and understand when it's nighttime. And evolutionarily, there are all kinds of chemical and hormonal signals that activate when the sun goes down. And at the top of the list is melatonin. So the pineal gland actually shuts off melatonin production whenever it gets sunlight. And it turns on melatonin production whenever the light goes away. So we actually have photoreceptors here in our pineal gland. I know it sounds kind of weird, but we have photoreceptors right here. So it's almost like we have a third eye over here that is detecting light, which is the pineal gland. And whenever the pineal gland gets light, it shuts off melatonin production. So when the sun goes down, our pineal gland is like, hey, it's time to get ready for bed. Let's secrete some melatonin. The problem is that if I use a TV screen or use my phone in bed, that UV light that's coming from the screen is going to shut off my pineal gland and shut off the melatonin production. So try to steer clear of UV light 1 to 2 hours before bed. The next thing that we're going to talk about is access to technology. So this one's really, really brutal because Vatas love technology. And so if you look at the Vata mind loves to wander. And so what that means is that if I'm trying to study and my mind wavers for about 30 seconds and I pick up my phone, an hour is going to go by before I realize it. So another key point about the phone usage is that it's not necessarily just about the productivity, because remember that engaging with your phone is going to increase your overall Vata. So the problem there is that even if you don't need to be productive, the more that you are letting your mind bounce from one technological app to another technological app. You're kind of feeding it, right? You're making it more like the wind, where now my mind is over here, and now my mind is over here, and now my mind is over here. I'm kind of feeding that wind-like quality of the mind. I'm feeding the sort of fluctuation of the mind. And the more that I feed that part of my mind, the worse my vata gets. And the worse my vata gets, the worse my anxiety gets. It's almost like phone usage trains your mind to be anxious and jump from one thought to another thought to another thought to another thought. So if your mind is very vata, and this I would say is just general technology hygiene, which we really need now more than ever, is to keep your electronic devices a little bit away from you. So when you go home, for example, don't carry your phone around, because if you carry it around, anytime you transition, like if I go to the bathroom and then I like walk out of the bathroom and I have my phone, I'm not gonna start working right away. I'm gonna just reflexively pull up my phone and I'm gonna reflexively get lost in it for 5 minutes, 15 minutes, half an hour, or an hour. And so we really need to be careful, because the vata mind is going to get distracted 100%. And if we have access to technology that can sort of give us that distraction and keep us stuck there for a while, we're gonna lose half an hour, we're gonna lose an hour. And what would become a 30-second natural vata distraction suddenly becomes a 1-hour detour. So what I highly recommend for people who have high vata is that they put their technological devices behind some kind of barrier. And what I mean by barrier is if you have to get up and walk to the other end of your room to pick up your phone, you're far less likely to reflexively pull it out. Or if you're at the library, like put it on silent and kind of avoid all notifications, because remember, what are notifications doing? Here's my mind over here, and my mind is very flighty if I'm vata. So if I hear this notification, my mind is gonna go over there, I'm gonna start tampering with it, right? So what you wanna do is increase that barrier of access to technology. And so that way, when your mind does wander, it's actually pretty hard to get that phone. And the cool thing about the wandering mind for a vata is that it'll wander away from the wandering eventually and return right back to the book if you're studying. It'll do that on its own. You just have to get over that hump of that brief distraction. So overall, like I mentioned, I think technology hygiene is increasingly important because technology is increasing our societal vata as a whole. This is also where we have to be really careful, because there are actually people who get paid, tons of money to sit there day in and day out and try to develop ways to keep you more glued to the device. So overall, I think that Ayurveda is a really, really awesome tool at our disposal to help us manage our anxiety. Remember that our genetics may contribute to our anxiety, our diagnosis may contribute to our anxiety, and our treatment may contribute to our anxiety. But despite all of those things being relatively constant, if you actually look at your own life, your anxiety is going to fluctuate wildly from day to day or hour to hour. And how can we smooth out those fluctuations? This is really where I think Ayurveda shines, because this isn't really the focus of Western psychiatry, right? What we focus on in Western psychiatry is the diagnosis and the treatment, not the daily fluctuations. And so my hope is that this understanding of Ayurveda will help you smooth out your experience of anxiety and let you have more good anxiety days as opposed to bad anxiety days. I feel really great about the video until you say action. And then it's like, I don't know where to start. Okay. My mouth goes dry. It's like literally like 5 seconds ago, I was totally fine. I was like, great, let's do this. Okay. Now I'd like to cover a little bit about Ayurveda for anxiety. And the first thing to understand, So let's talk a little bit about Ayurveda for anxiety. The first thing that I kind of want to